Dawn came quietly on June 22nd, 1941. Across a frontier stretching nearly 2,000 miles, the sky was still pale, the fields wet with dew, the forests unmoving. Soviet border guards stood watch, believing this would be another tense but uneventful morning. Many of them had been ordered not to provoke the Germans under any circumstances. Some had even been punished days earlier for reporting suspicious troop movements. Moscow had assured them there would be no war. Then, without warning, the horizon exploded. Artillery thundered with such force that the ground itself seemed to split open. German shells slammed into barracks, rail yards, airfields, and command posts all at once. Bridges disintegrated. Telephone lines went dead. Soviet aircraft were destroyed where they sat, wings burning before engines could even start. Within minutes, entire units ceased to exist. This was not a battle. It was an annihilation. By the time the sun fully rose, more than 3 million Axis soldiers were already advancing eastward. Infantry marched through smoke. Tanks crushed border markers beneath their tracks. Paratroopers fell from the sky like dark seeds scattered by the wind. For many Soviet soldiers, the first sign of war was death itself. Operation Barbarossa had begun. History often describes this moment in grand terms: the largest invasion in human history, the clash of titans, Hitler versus Stalin, Nazism against communism, a turning point of the Second World War. But those phrases are too clean, too distant, too safe. Because Barbarossa was not merely a military operation. It was not even simply a war of conquest. It was something far more extreme. A war designed from the beginning to erase entire peoples, starve cities into silence, and turn the land itself into a graveyard. What unfolded after June 22nd would kill more human beings than any campaign before or since. Entire armies would vanish. Entire villages would burn. Millions would die without ever holding a weapon. And the scale of suffering would be so vast that even today it is only partially understood. Operation Barbarossa was worse than you think, not because it failed, but because of what it unleashed. To understand why, we have to go back, not to the morning of invasion, but to the ideas that made it inevitable. In the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at the peak of his power. France had collapsed in 6 weeks. British forces had barely escaped at Dunkirk. Western Europe lay under German control. For the first time, Hitler believed history itself was bending to his will. Yet in Berlin, his thoughts were already turning east. To Hitler, the Soviet Union was not a conventional enemy. It was an ideological abomination, a racial threat, a vast, fertile space that he believed destiny had reserved for Germany. He called it Lebensraum, living space, and he believed it could only be secured through destruction. The Soviet people, in Nazi ideology, were not adversaries to be defeated, but obstacles to be removed. Slavs were considered subhuman. Jews were seen as an existential poison embedded within Bolshevism. Communism itself was portrayed as a Jewish conspiracy strangling Europe. This was not rhetoric meant merely to inspire soldiers. It was policy. Long before the first shot was fired, German planners accepted that this war would break every previous rule. International law would not apply, prisoners would not be protected, civilians would not be spared, hunger would be weaponized, terror would be routine. Even the German army, the Wehrmacht, often portrayed as a professional, apolitical force, was fully integrated into this vision. Orders were drafted that explicitly freed soldiers from punishment for crimes committed against Soviet civilians. Political officers were marked for execution. Entire categories of people were condemned before the invasion even began. Barbarossa was designed not just to defeat the Red Army, but to dismantle Soviet society itself. On the other side of the border, Joseph Stalin refused to believe it was coming. Despite an avalanche of intelligence warnings from British agents, Soviet spies, even German deserters, Stalin convinced himself that Hitler would not risk a two-front war. He believed any German provocations were attempts to lure the Soviet Union into conflict prematurely. He believed time was on his side. As a result, Soviet forces were dangerously unprepared. Units were deployed forward in exposed positions. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip. Ammunition depots were poorly camouflaged. Commanders hesitated to act without explicit orders, terrified of being accused of treason or panic. When the invasion came, the Red Army was caught not merely off guard, but psychologically paralyzed. Within days, German forces achieved advances that stunned even their own generals. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken in colossal pockets. Roads clogged with fleeing civilians and retreating soldiers, all moving east beneath relentless air attack. Yet this apparent triumph masked a deeper, darker reality. The speed of the German advance created a vacuum where law, restraint, and humanity vanished. Behind the front lines, special killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, began their work. They followed the army closely, moving from town to town, village to village, rounding up Jews, political officials, and anyone deemed undesirable. Men were shot in forests. Women and children were marched to ravines. Mass graves filled faster than they could be dug. This was not collateral damage, it was the mission. And still, the worst was yet to come. Because Barbarossa was built on assumptions that would soon collide with reality. Assumptions about distance, weather, resistance, and the very nature of war itself. As German columns pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, they carried with them not only their weapons, but the seeds of catastrophe. A catastrophe that would consume soldiers and civilians alike, reshape the entire war, and leave scars that remain visible generations later. The invasion had begun with thunder and fire, but it would end in something far colder and far more terrible. In the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, everything seemed to confirm Hitler's faith in destiny. German armored columns advanced with breathtaking speed. Panzer divisions sliced through Soviet defenses as if they barely existed. Luftwaffe pilots reported entire airfields destroyed in a single pass. Prisoners poured westward in numbers so vast that guards could not count them accurately. Some German officers spoke openly of the war being over by autumn. Maps in Berlin were redrawn almost daily. To many inside the Nazi leadership, this was not merely success, it was vindication. Proof that the Soviet Union was a hollow structure, rotten from within, held together only by fear. Hitler famously declared that all Germany needed to do was kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. But what looked like collapse was something else entirely. The Red Army was not disintegrating, it was bleeding catastrophically, but it was also absorbing the blow in a way no other European army had. Entire formations were lost, yet new ones continued to appear. Commanders were killed, but replacements took their place. Cities fell, but resistance hardened. The scale of the Soviet Union itself began to distort German expectations. Distances that looked manageable on maps became endless corridors of dust and mud. Roads disappeared into forests and marshland. Rail lines used a different gauge, forcing supplies to be unloaded and reloaded by hand. Fuel trucks lagged behind advancing tanks. Ammunition ran short. Spare parts became precious. German soldiers began to notice something unsettling. They were moving faster than their war could sustain. Yet the leadership refused to slow down. Barbarossa was built on speed, shock, and relentless forward motion. Every delay was seen as weakness. Every pause was treated as a threat to victory. Commanders who urged caution were ignored or overruled. The belief that the Soviet Union was on the brink of total collapse became dogma. This belief proved fatal. As German forces drove deeper into Soviet territory, they encountered not a crumbling state, but a population being radicalized by invasion. Villages that had initially greeted German troops with wary neutrality began to change. Rumors spread of executions, of burned homes, of mass shootings. Hope curdled into fear. Fear hardened into hatred. Partisan warfare emerged almost organically. Rail lines were sabotaged. Supply convoys vanished in forests. Isolated soldiers were found dead, their bodies mutilated or left as warnings. The German response was brutal and indiscriminate. Entire villages were razed in retaliation. Civilians were executed for suspected collaboration. Hostages were taken and shot publicly. Each reprisal created more resistance. Each act of terror multiplied the enemy. Behind the front lines, the machinery of genocide accelerated. The Einsatzgruppen did not operate in secrecy. They often worked openly, sometimes with the assistance of local collaborators, sometimes watched silently by Wehrmacht units. Mass shootings became routine. Ravines like Barbarossa filled with tens of thousands of bodies in days. Children were not spared. Infants were thrown into pits or shot in their mothers' arms. For the killers, this was exhausting work. Ammunition was consumed at an alarming rate. Morale among execution squads began to fray. The psychological toll was noted, but the solution was not mercy, it was efficiency. Methods were refined, procedures standardized. This was the prelude to industrialized murder. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership was awakening from shock. Stalin, stunned by the scale of the invasion, initially withdrew from public view. For several days, the Soviet Union functioned without clear direction from its leader. Some feared he would collapse entirely. Others believed a coup was imminent. Instead, Stalin hardened. He addressed the nation not as a revolutionary, but as a Russian patriot. He invoked history, land, and survival. The language shifted from ideology to existence. This was no longer a war of systems, it was a war for life itself. Factories were dismantled and moved east beyond the Urals. Entire industrial cities were packed onto trains and relocated under fire. Workers slept beside machines as production resumed in empty fields and forests. Women, teenagers, and the elderly replaced men at assembly lines. The Soviet Union was bleeding, but it was not dying. German intelligence failed to grasp this transformation. They continued to interpret Soviet resistance as chaotic, irrational, and temporary. Losses were counted, divisions erased, territories conquered. What could not be measured was resolve. What could not be mapped was sacrifice. And as summer stretched into autumn, the first cracks appeared. German soldiers, trained and equipped for a short campaign, began to feel the weight of time. Uniforms wore thin. Boots fell apart. Letters from home spoke of shortages and bombings. The promised end of the war receded with every mile marched. Yet the advance continued. Toward Leningrad, toward Kiev, toward Moscow. Each objective carried its own obsession, its own logic, its own disaster waiting to unfold. Because Barbarossa was not one campaign, it was three, each pulling resources in different directions. Commanders argued, timetables slipped, momentum faltered. And somewhere beneath the roar of engines and artillery, a question began to form, quietly, dangerously. What if the Soviet Union did not fall? By the time the first cold rains arrived, that question could no longer be dismissed. By September 1941, the war in the East no longer resembled the campaign Germany believed it was fighting. The easy victories of summer had given way to something slower, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. The front had stretched far beyond its original design. Supply lines ran hundreds of miles back through hostile territory. Trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Fuel arrived late, if it arrived at all. And still, Berlin demanded more. The German High Command fractured under the weight of success, or what it mistook for success. Instead of concentrating on a single decisive objective, Hitler intervened directly, redirecting armored forces south toward Ukraine and north toward Leningrad, delaying the push toward Moscow. The decision was ideological as much as strategic. Ukraine's grain fields were seen as vital to feeding the Reich. Leningrad, cradle of Bolshevism, was to be erased as a symbol. Moscow, though important, could wait. The Soviet state, Hitler believed, was already mortally wounded. This assumption ignored one critical truth: time was now the enemy. Every week of delay allowed the Red Army to reorganize. New divisions formed in the interior. Officers learned from disaster. Defensive lines hardened. And as autumn approached, the Soviet landscape itself prepared its counterattack. The rains came first. The Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian mud season, turned roads into rivers of sludge. Tanks sank axle-deep, trucks spun helplessly. Artillery had to be dragged by hand. Marches that should have taken hours stretched into days. German soldiers, exhausted and increasingly cynical, cursed the land itself. Yet even now, the Wehrmacht pressed on. In the south, the encirclement at Kiev became one of the largest in history. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. From a military perspective, it was a triumph of maneuver and coordination. From a human perspective, it was a death sentence. The prisoners were marched westward with little food, no shelter, and almost no medical care. Tens of thousands collapsed along the roads. Guards shot those who could not keep up. Camps overflowed, turning into open-air pens where men starved by the thousands. This was not neglect, it was policy. German planners had calculated that millions of Soviet prisoners would die. Their deaths were seen as a logistical solution, fewer mouths to feed. Hunger became a weapon as deliberate as artillery. And hunger did not stop at the camps. Cities behind the front were systematically stripped of food. Grain was seized, livestock slaughtered or driven west. The German army fed itself by emptying the countryside, leaving civilians to survive however they could. In Leningrad, this policy reached its most terrifying form. The city was surrounded, cut off from supplies, and deliberately starved. Artillery pounded neighborhoods, but the true killer was hunger. Bread rations shrank to a few hundred grams, then to almost nothing. People boiled wallpaper for paste. They ate pets. They ate leather. They ate the dead. Cannibalism became a whispered reality. German commanders knew exactly what they were doing. The city was not to be stormed. It was to disappear. Meanwhile, in the center, the road to Moscow reopened. Operation Typhoon was launched in October, a renewed drive toward the Soviet capital. Once again, German forces achieved massive encirclements. Once again, prisoners were taken in staggering numbers. And once again, victory seemed within reach. But the weather turned. The rains gave way to frost, then to snow. Temperatures plunged far below anything German soldiers had experienced. Vehicles froze overnight. Oil thickened. Weapons jammed. Men wrapped themselves in newspapers and rags, desperately trying to retain heat. Winter uniforms had not been issued. The war, after all, was supposed to be over. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, launched counterattacks. Fresh Siberian divisions, well equipped for cold weather, appeared on the flanks. Intelligence failures had convinced Hitler that Japan would attack the Soviet Far East. When that did not happen, Stalin redeployed these forces west. The German advance slowed, then stalled. Outside Moscow, soldiers could see the city's spires in the distance. Some claimed they could glimpse the Kremlin. It was close enough to believe, far enough to remain unreachable. And as German momentum faded, something profound shifted. For the first time since June, the Red Army was not retreating, it was pushing back. The myth of German invincibility cracked. What followed would not be a sudden collapse, but a grinding descent into a war of attrition the Reich was never equipped to win. By December 1941, Operation Barbarossa had reached the edge of its own impossibility. German forces stood exhausted in frozen trenches outside Moscow, their advance measured no longer in kilometers, but in meters. Frostbite claimed more men than Soviet bullets. Horses froze where they stood. Engines had to be kept running through the night, or they would never start again. The Wehrmacht had not planned for this war. Not really. Barbarossa was conceived as a campaign of weeks, not months. Its logistics were improvised. Its supply system was built on assumptions that no longer existed. The deeper the German army went, the less capable it became of sustaining itself. And yet, retreat was forbidden. Hitler issued stand-fast orders that locked entire armies in place. Commanders who suggested withdrawal were dismissed or threatened. Flexibility, the very quality that had defined early German success, was replaced by ideological rigidity. When the Soviet counteroffensive struck in early December, it came as a shock. Red Army units surged forward through snowstorms, supported by skis, sleds, and cold-hardened equipment. German lines bent, then broke in places. Entire formations were forced back, abandoning heavy equipment in the snow. For the first time, German soldiers fled. This was not the decisive collapse many hoped for, but it was something more important. It was proof that the Wehrmacht could be beaten, that the war in the East would not be short, that Germany was now locked in a struggle of survival against an enemy with deeper reserves and a higher tolerance for suffering. And still, the worst crimes of Barbarossa were unfolding far from the front lines. As the war dragged on, the initial mass shootings carried out by Einsatzgruppen proved insufficient. They were too slow, too visible, too psychologically taxing for the killers themselves. New solutions were sought. Mobile gas vans appeared, sealing victims inside and pumping exhaust fumes into the compartments as the vehicles drove to burial sites. Entire communities vanished in hours. The transition from bullets to gas marked a chilling evolution, murder optimized, suffering mechanized. Barbarossa was no longer just a military operation. It had become the testing ground for genocide. The Wehrmacht was not a bystander. Army units provided logistics, security, and manpower. They handed over civilians. They guarded execution sites. They enforced starvation policies. The idea of a clean army collapsed under the weight of evidence both then and now. Meanwhile, Soviet civilians bore the full weight of occupation. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were erased, crops were burned, wells poisoned. Families were driven into forests to starve or freeze. In Belarus and Western Russia, entire regions were transformed into zones of death. The German response to resistance was not containment, it was annihilation. This brutality did not pacify the population, it ignited it. Partisan networks grew bolder and more organized. Sabotage intensified. German casualties mounted far behind the front. The occupiers were fighting not just an army, but a people. Inside the Soviet Union, the war reshaped everything. Cities became fortresses. Civilians dug trenches alongside soldiers. Children served as messengers and lookouts. Losses were absorbed with grim determination. The state demanded everything, and society gave it, because the alternative was extinction. The scale of death became almost incomprehensible. By the end of 1941, millions were already dead. Soldiers, civilians, prisoners. Entire armies had been lost, entire populations displaced. Yet this was only the beginning. Barbarossa had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The war in the East would not end in compromise. There would be no negotiated peace, no limited victory. The nature of the conflict itself made that impossible. It was now a war of total destruction. For those caught inside Operation Barbarossa, the war did not unfold in grand strategies or sweeping arrows on maps. It arrived in fragments, in moments, in the sudden collapse of normal life. A Soviet infantryman near Smolensk remembered waking to artillery so intense it felt as if the air itself was tearing apart. Orders never came. Officers were dead or missing. He fired until his rifle jammed, then ran until his legs failed. When he was captured days later, he weighed almost nothing. He would not survive the winter. A Jewish schoolteacher in Ukraine watched neighbors she had known all her life avert their eyes as German trucks arrived. Lists were read. People were marched away. She hid in a cellar for 3 days, listening to gunfire echo from the forest. When she emerged, the village was silent. She was the only one left. A German tank commander wrote home in August, confident and proud. By November, his letters had changed. He spoke of endless roads, burning villages, and the smell of death that never faded. In December, the letters stopped. These were not exceptions. They were the rule. For Soviet prisoners of war, capture meant almost certain death. Millions were herded into makeshift camps without shelter, sanitation, or food. Men froze together at night to share warmth. The dead were used as windbreaks. Disease spread unchecked. Guards watched impassively as bodies piled up. By spring 1942, more than half of all Soviet POWs captured during Barbarossa were dead. Civilians fared little better. In occupied territories, survival became a daily negotiation with hunger and fear. Families dismantled their homes for firewood. Children learned to distinguish the sound of German trucks from Soviet aircraft. Silence became a skill. In some places, collaboration was a means of survival. In others, it was a death sentence waiting to be delivered. The line between victim and participant blurred under pressure. Partisans lived in forests, enduring cold, hunger, and constant pursuit. Many were teenagers, some were entire families. Reprisals were swift and merciless. For every attack, dozens of civilians might be executed. Villages were burned with people still inside. Yet the resistance did not stop. In Leningrad, the siege became a slow-motion apocalypse. People collapsed in the streets from hunger. Trolley cars stopped running because no one had the strength to operate them. The city recorded deaths with grim efficiency, even as officials themselves starved. Cultural life persisted in fragments, concerts held in freezing halls, poems written on scraps of paper as acts of defiance against annihilation. The city refused to die. German soldiers, too, were consumed by the war. Many had entered the Soviet Union believing they were liberators or warriors of civilization. Months of brutality, cold, and moral collapse stripped those illusions away. Some embraced violence. Others broke under its weight. Alcoholism, desertion, and psychological trauma spread through the ranks. The Eastern Front devoured empathy. For those who participated in mass killings, the war left scars that could not be spoken of. Some sought transfers. Others rationalized their actions. A few documented them with photographs, souvenirs of horror that would resurface decades later. Barbarossa created a universe where atrocity was normalized, and survival often required complicity. And above all of it loomed the knowledge, unspoken but understood, that this war would not end with mercy. Because both sides had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. By the time the winter of 1941 tightened its grip, Operation Barbarossa had already sealed Germany's fate. The illusion of a quick, decisive victory lay buried beneath snowdrifts and frozen corpses outside Moscow. What remained was a war of endurance, one that Germany had neither the resources nor the moral framework to survive. The Soviet counteroffensive did not destroy the Wehrmacht, but it broke its rhythm. German forces were pushed back dozens, sometimes hundreds of kilometers. Equipment was abandoned. Supply dumps were lost. Entire units disintegrated under pressure they had never been trained to withstand. And still, Berlin refused to accept reality. Hitler interpreted setbacks not as strategic failures, but as tests of will. He demanded sacrifice instead of adjustment. He replaced experienced commanders with loyalists. He doubled down on ideological war, convinced that terror would compensate for logistics and resolve would overcome geography. The result was escalation without control. In 1942, Germany renewed its offensive, this time toward the south, toward oil fields, toward the Caucasus, toward Stalingrad. Barbarossa had failed to end the war, but it had transformed it into something even more catastrophic. Stalingrad was not an accident. It was the logical continuation of Barbarossa's worldview. The city became a symbol because Hitler demanded it be one. Its destruction was meant to prove that German will remain unbroken. Instead, it became a furnace that consumed an entire army. Street by street, floor by floor, the battle erased distinctions between soldier and rubble. Winter returned, supplies vanished, encirclement closed, starvation followed. When the Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, it marked the first time a German field army had been destroyed in its entirety. Tens of thousands went into captivity. Few would return. The war in the East had reached its irreversible climax. From that point on, Germany fought defensively, bleeding manpower and material it could not replace. The Soviet Union, scarred beyond measure, now possessed momentum, experience, and an industrial base operating at full capacity. Barbarossa had awakened a giant and enraged it. Yet even as the front shifted westward, the legacy of the invasion deepened. The policies unleashed in 1941 did not end with military failure. They intensified. Deportations expanded. Extermination camps were constructed. The logic of total war against imagined enemies evolved into the Holocaust in its most industrial form. Barbarossa was the bridge between invasion and genocide. The Eastern Front would continue to consume lives until Berlin itself lay in ruins. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was no longer who would win, but how much destruction would be inflicted before the end. Germany had gambled everything on a war of annihilation, and lost everything because of it. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the lands touched first by Operation Barbarossa were almost unrecognizable. Cities lay flattened into skeletal outlines. Villages that had existed for centuries were gone without names left to remember them. Forests hid mass graves so vast that the soil itself had changed composition. Rivers carried the residue of war long after the fighting moved on. The human cost defied comprehension. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people, soldiers who never returned, civilians who starved, froze, or were executed, entire generations erased. Almost every family carried absence like an open wound. Victory did not feel like triumph, it felt like survival. For survivors of the siege of Leningrad, the war never truly ended. Hunger had rewritten their bodies. Trauma followed them into old age. The memory of watching loved ones disappear one by one remained sharper than any parade or medal. In Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, Jewish communities were gone, not displaced, not scattered. Gone. Synagogues stood empty or destroyed. Names survived only in fragments of testimony. The Holocaust in the East, carried out largely by bullets, not gas, remained less visible to the world, but no less total. German prisoners of war marched east this time. Hundreds of thousands died in captivity, victims of revenge, neglect, and exhaustion. The cycle of brutality did not end cleanly. It simply exhausted itself. Moral clarity was blurred by the scale of suffering on all sides. In Germany, the reckoning was uneven. The Nuremberg trials exposed the crimes of the Nazi leadership, but many perpetrators of Barbarossa faded into anonymity. Einsatzgruppen commanders were tried, but countless collaborators were not. Wehrmacht officers reintegrated into post-war society. The myth of a clean army lingered for decades, comforting and false. In the Soviet Union, memory was shaped by power. The war was remembered as the Great Patriotic War, a story of unity and heroism. The scale of victory overshadowed the scale of repression that preceded it. Stalin emerged not as a tyrant whose policies had crippled his own defenses, but as a wartime leader who had guided the nation through catastrophe. The truth was more complicated and more painful. Barbarossa had not only destroyed lives, it had reshaped the moral landscape of Europe. It normalized total war. It demonstrated how ideology could strip entire populations of humanity. It proved that modern states could mobilize industrial capacity not just to fight, but to annihilate. The scars were not confined to borders. They lived in silence, in stories never told, in archives unopened, in graves still undiscovered. And yet, even after all this, the full meaning of Operation Barbarossa remained unfinished, because its consequences did not end in 1945. They echoed forward. Operation Barbarossa is often remembered as a military failure, a strategic overreach, a gamble that cost Hitler the war. That framing is incomplete and dangerously comforting. Barbarossa matters not because it failed, but because of what it revealed. It showed how quickly modern warfare can become genocidal when ideology replaces restraint, how easily bureaucracies can transform starvation into policy and murder into logistics, how ordinary people, soldiers, clerks, neighbors, can become instruments of destruction when the state declares some lives unworthy of existence. It also revealed the limits of power. Germany possessed tactical brilliance, experienced troops, and early momentum. What it lacked was humility, empathy, and realism. Barbarossa collapsed not just because of winter or distance, but because it underestimated the human capacity to endure and to resist. The Soviet response, for all its heroism, came at an unbearable cost. Victory was achieved through sacrifice so vast it reshaped national identity. The war taught the Soviet state that survival justified anything, a lesson that would echo through decades of repression and fear. Today, the landscapes of Eastern Europe still carry Barbarossa's imprint. Mass graves are still being uncovered. Families are still learning how ancestors died. Political narratives still compete over memory, responsibility, and meaning. The war is not history there, it is inheritance. Barbarossa warns us about the fragility of civilization. It reminds us that the greatest crimes are rarely committed in chaos alone, but through planning, paperwork, and belief. That annihilation can be framed as necessity, that the language of security can become the language of extermination. And it forces a final, uncomfortable recognition. Operation Barbarossa was worse than you think because it was not an aberration. It was a possibility. One that emerges whenever power dehumanizes, whenever ideology hardens into destiny, whenever leaders convince themselves that entire peoples can be erased without consequence. The invasion began at dawn, with artillery fire ripping open the earth. But its true devastation unfolded slowly, through hunger, cold, obedience, and silence. And that is why it must be remembered. Not as a battle, not as a campaign, but as a warning written in blood across an entire continent.